Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everyday Anarchism. And my returning guest today is Mark Bittman. I don't think Mark needs an introduction, but Mark writes about food and the food system. And if you want to learn everything about the food system, you can read his book, Animal Vegetable Junk, or just listen to the podcast episode that he and I and Ricardo Salvador did on that. Mark, thank you. Thank you so much for coming back on.
Great to be here, Graham, and yeah, sure we'll have fun. I should just say to people, if you really want to find out about me or whatever it is I'm doing, it's mostly at markbittman.com. But we'll talk about a number of different things, I'm sure. Yeah,
Yeah, I highly
listen,
recommend
listen
the
to this
Bittman
episode
podcast.
that's happening right now, people.
That's also good. That's also a good way
That'll
to
work.
learn. Yeah, so let's start with
Let's start with seed oils because I don't know. I mean, I know what they are, but I don't know what's happening. Why is there a fuss about them?
yeah, okay. So the reason why I brought this up, and the last episode I recorded right after the election, and it wasn't
Right.
supposed to be about the election, but it ended up about the election. That's just what's happening. So how can I put this? So seed oils, I heard about this meme, I don't know, a few years ago. That there's a meme out there on the internet, and I'm pretty much off all the social media, so I don't see this stuff. I just hear about it when people tell me or if there's a news story about it. Apparently seed oils, Mark, like fluoride and vaccines are poisoning
Mm,
us. And
mm.
apparently part of RFK's campaign is against seed oils. And the reason why I bring this up and I wanted to talk to you is I was I was with my neighbors, and they know about this podcast, and they're trying to get my thoughts. And the thing is, when RFK says things like, the government doesn't have your best interest at heart, and big ag is bad for you, and our health system is terrible. Honestly, he doesn't sound that different from
No,
the kind of things that you and I
from
would
me,
say,
right?
right? So, like, there's this the
Or when he
strangest.
says vaccines cause autism and this whole other string of lunatic stuff, then you feel like, okay, does he actually? Where does he come up with this shit that he says? But yeah, the stuff he says about food it does sound familiar. I think I don't think he's going to get. I mean, it would be great to think we had an ally in government, but to think that we have an ally in the Trump government is just a bridge too far. I don't see it mattering, happening. I, I just don't see it. If I'm proven wrong, great. I mean, the guy starts saying, let's get ultra processed food out of school lunches. I mean, if he actually says that and does something about it, great. The seed oil thing, it's not seed. I mean, I don't know what he's saying because he may be saying something completely, insane. But the only thing I know about seed oils going back forever is that there are things that it's very easy to extract oil from, like olives. Like you could almost do it by squeezing them in your hand. It's not that easy, but if you can imagine a mechanical press that's got olives, an old fashioned screw press that has olives piled in it with mats, so that there's a bit of a filter. And in the old days, until quite recently, I mean, really until 40 years ago, you could find these everywhere, and you can still find them, but they're now antiques. But in the old days, that screw would be turned by a mule or horse or some beast of burden. The oil comes out mixed with water and other fluids, and then it's spun to separate it, and centrifugal force separates it. And that was done in the old days by a hand or animal cranked geared thing. Now it's all done by machine, of course, but it's very, very easy to separate oil from olives. Pretty easy to separate oil from peanuts. There's a third thing I'm not thinking about, a third oil I'm not thinking about that's easy to get. But some oils are hard to extract. So corn oil, which is not a seed oil, but corn oil is hard to extract, and canola oil is hard to extract. That's flaxseed. Um, Sunflower. sesame, they're harder. They're harder to get the oil out of the stuff. So if you can imagine, how would if you were the inventor, how would could you imagine getting oil out of corn? That seems like a challenge, or coconut, or sesame, even sesame for that matter. Although you might be able to imagine it with sesame and coconut. It turns out it's not that hard, but you have to know what you're doing. Blah blah blah. But the thing is that they started extracting oils from some of those harder to. This is probably the least important part of our conversation, so I'm going to speed up.
Go
They
for it.
started extracting oils from some of those harder to get oil from materials like corn and sunflower and flax using chemicals. And the chemicals that they're using are harmful. So that's why you want cold pressed oils to the extent that you can get them, because cold pressed oils means they're extracted mechanically, basically, not with heat and not with chemicals, and that's what you want. I don't know anything about seed oils being intrinsically bad for you. I don't know anything about that. That doesn't mean that I know everything. Um, that maybe I have something to discover, but I'm not quite sure I'm going to have things to discover by listening to RFK.
No,
That's,
I my
but who
understanding
knows?
my understanding is also that I mean there is the concerns about the chemicals, but essentially the line is something kind of nuts. That seed oils are dangerous, and it's not true. And then I think seed oils are often found in pretty high concentrations in the ultra processed foods. In other words, there's all sorts of ways to see these connections, and there's frankly all sorts of ways to make a sensible claim that there's dangers in seed oils depending on the chemicals and the overuse of seed oils in ultra processed foods and all this stuff. Like, all this stuff makes sense, and this is the kind of healthy skepticism we want out there. We meaning you and I imagine the listeners want out there.
Mhm.
um when corporations are processing our foods, when we have this thing, the food system that you are one of the greatest critics of. And the thing that scares people about, a show like mine and using the word anarchism and things like that, is I'm just one step away from, you know 9/11 was an inside job, and Putin is great for the world, and just like I struggle like with almost every episode, Mark, of how do I keep my my skepticism of the mainstream media without sounding like one of the people who's always talking about the dangers of the mainstream media, because those people, I don't want to be associated
Yeah,
with them, and that's just
yeah.
hard. So that's why I thought I might start there, because I mean, I don't know. You are a representative of the mainstream media, or
Right.
were,
I was.
and
I was a part. Yeah, whatever. I don't know. Yeah. I'm critical of the Times and other things also, on the other hand. Yeah, I'm not certainly less critical of them than I am of Fox,
yeah,
which is
exactly.
also part of the mainstream media,
Yeah,
much as it doesn't like to admit
I
it.
know.
Um,
Yeah,
I mean, it's funny. I thought of you the other day. I mean, I knew we were speaking, but was the election a week, 2 weeks ago at
yeah.
this
2 weeks
point?
ago tomorrow. Yeah,
Um, So I was in DC talking to a friend of mine. It doesn't matter that it was DC, but I was talking to a friend of mine whose politics I agree with 90, there's a very high correlation of the things that we believe. And yeah, you'd be in there. And I thought of you because I thought, I wonder if I just talk with Graham about this, very 70s, 60s notion that I had um, that Kamala Harris wasn't distinguishing herself enough, and that of course, I supported her, and I've always supported Democratic candidates because they are the lesser of two evils. They always have been the lesser of two evils, but man, she did not portray herself even as the lesser of two evils, unless you were really concerned that Donald Trump might be a fascist, which we have yet to find out. What he's going to do about dismantling government. But I just thought, why did she not just take the super, or it's not even super, but the actual left road? Was that so obviously to their strategists the wrong way to go? And then I thought, our conversation went, well, the strategists were all Obama people, and Obama people are middle of the road Democrats. It's what they are. They're not left wing Democrats, and we don't really even know what her politics are. But obviously, Bernie and AOC and whoever else you might think who's still in the Democratic Party who has like the potential to say, you're a strong black woman representing people of color, representing women. What are the issues that are important to those people? Why don't you get out there and say that stuff? Because then you'll be speaking to a real constituency. Anyway, I thought of you. This has nothing to do with food. It's just
Look,
it's recency bias. It's the election.
I mean, we'll get to food. We started with Cito. Look, Mark, I'm happy to just talk about what we feel like talking about, and I think
Yeah.
it'll be an interesting conversation. I The first thing to say is I think about this. I think about this all the time. I mean, I was thinking about like my relationship to the Democratic Party because it's hard for me to imagine being more aligned with the Democratic Party given the system we have. I mean, I am completely committed to the Democratic Party. The idea that I have friends who would vote for Jill Stein or whatever is nonsense. I think this is kind of getting at what I was trying to talk about with RFK. On the other hand, I'm very, very far from the Democratic Party. If
Right.
we if
Right.
we had a system, I mean, there's all sorts of problems with the parliamentary system, but here in Chapel Hill, we could have a system where a sort of, every year the election for parliament would be between like a Bernie Democrat and a Kamala Obama Democrat. And I would, of course, vote for the Bernie Democrat. That's a no
Hmm.
brainer. Within the system we have, the Democratic Party is the lesser of two evils, but it's not close, and there's no other options.
Right. Right. Yeah.
They think they thought, I mean, this is my reading, but I mean, I'm sure everyone has heard this, but I'll say it anyway. The first obvious thing is they thought that if they ran out with Liz Cheney and we're talking about making America's military super strong or whatever, the legendary Reagan Democrats, I guess, would come back to the fold. I don't know why they thought that, but
Hmm.
they did think that. And then the obvious thing, and this goes back to Obama, and you and I have talked about this, they do think they get the economists in the room, and the economists tell them, you can't say universal health care, you can't say child care for all, you can't say any of those things. A, because we can't afford them, and B, they'll just call you a socialist and you'll lose the election. And I think both of these things are untrue, but we haven't yet had a Democratic candidate run on those things to find out.
Right. I mean, but I don't think she needed to say, I'm a socialist. I just think she needed to say, I'm in favor of universal health care. I'm in favor of free child care for working people with less than such and such an income. I'm in favor of universal school lunch. I'm in favor of good food for all, for that matter. I'm in favor of improved public transportation. Da 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 da. Government debt is not as important as people having decent lives. Sort of period. She didn't even say that. The opportunity economy sounds like she supports Uber.
Yeah. No, you're look, you're right, and then the flip side is, for all of the nonsense that Trump says, and he's obviously at least playing a monster, and I agree with you. Whether or not he's a fascist, we don't.
Playing them. I like that. Yeah.
Yes, he's pretending to be a strong man for sure. Whether or not he is a strong man of the kind, I actually don't think he is. But I have a podcast with anarchism in the title, so I'm gonna, in the next few years, if the if the roundups actually happen, I'm gonna get rounded up, and
Right.
I don't think they're going to. But he does say shit like, I'm going to protect your Medicare and Social Security. He does actually promise people a, a good life. Now, he doesn't mean it. His promises are absolutely fraudulent, but he says it, and Kamala didn't.
Right. I mean, I don't think you can. I don't think you can protect those entitlement programs and dismantle the government at the same time.
I know, but that's why it's so frustrating that the Democrats are living in quote the reality based community, right? That's like an old quote from oh, was it Karl Rove or something? Because they're just they think that they want to be very careful and make sure any plan they come up with has spreadsheets backing it. These spreadsheets are frankly nonsense. They're nonsensical. They're not actually based in reality.
Right,
So why don't you just say exactly what you said, Mark? I want people to have food and shelter, and the Democratic Party stands for people having jobs and food and shelter and child care. That
right.
seems like an easy pitch, but
It
she did
seemed
not
like
make it.
she didn't make it. It seemed like she was starting to make it, and someone warned her off, just like
Yeah.
Obama. Just like it felt like Obama, at least Michelle Obama, got warned off around food early on, and
Yeah.
I feel like um, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened to the. I'll tell you who I'm really pissed off at is
All right.
those Pod Save America guys. Because they're funny and they're cute and they really sound like they're smart, but yeah, the Obama Democrat thing. And I know a lot of people who defended Obama and his policies and his way of doing right through the Hillary election, right through the last, what is it? He left office in 2016. So right through the
Jesus, yeah.
last 8 years. And this year they were like, okay, I now see what you've been saying about Obama. This wing of the party is going nowhere. So,
Uh,
well, let's talk about food. I mean,
yeah,
no one
well,
wants not.
no, no. Before we get to food, I have to say I have been annoyed with Pod Save America.
Those guys,
Yeah.
man.
It's like, and there's so many people in my life that are just like, oh yeah, Graham, I never listen to your podcast. And I'm like, that's fine, that's fine. You don't have to apologize, it's fine. And then they say, but I just listen to
I
all the
listen
episodes
all
of
the
Pod
time to
Save America.
Positive America.
It's like, Jesus Christ, you don't have to listen to my podcast, but that's like that like warmed
It's
over.
kind of a comedy show, but it just stopped being funny. And they were just so smug.
Yeah, smug. I mean, that's the Obama economist, technocrat, lawyer, elite inside the beltway way of operating. It is smugness. We know better. Yep.
Right, but it's also, yeah, and it's people actually did want change. Obama promised change. There really wasn't much. Hillary didn't even promise that.
Yeah.
Trump promised it and didn't deliver it, but he seemed, to most people, majority of people who bothered to vote, he seemed more credible in promising change this time around than
Yep.
Harris did. So there's nothing, you can't deny that. You can call the guy a crazy person and call him a fascist if you want to, but there was an unsatisfying administration called the Obama administration. There was an unsatisfying administration called the Bush administration, which was rescued, ironically enough, by 9/11. Um, and so that unsatisfying administration was replaced by an administration that appeared to be for change. That was the Obama administration. The Obama administration um, was replaced by the candidate that seemed to represent change, and that was the Trump administration. When Trump failed at being not only a change candidate but an effective president, um, then Biden became the candidate for change, which is pretty funny because he's an old hardline Democrat. But in fact, he did a pretty decent job for an old line Democrat, but he didn't change anything. They didn't talk about it. They didn't know how to talk about the good stuff that they did, the infrastructure and all of that, supporting people through COVID and all of that, which they did a pretty good job of, better than most would have. And so then Trump became the change candidate again. And it's pretty obvious you need to be the change candidate. The incumbent always loses.
Yeah, no, I
So
come.
instead of being the change candidate, she said, "Oh, I wouldn't do anything different than Joe did." Okay, well, Joe didn't create meaningful jobs, and Joe didn't, feed people who weren't getting fed, and Joe didn't create new housing or protect people from high grocery prices. So vote for the guy who might, even if he is insane. At
Yeah.
least he's funny, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think the fact that, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that there's no chance that he actually might do any of those things, that just, I don't know, people were willing to roll the dice. I'm not that interested in calling them low information voters and saying that they
Huh.
understood that things sucked and that one guy said he was going to make things better. That's,
I like that low. Where'd that come from?
oh,
Low information voter.
oh, that's what
That's a
that
polite word, like polite way of saying stupid.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I
Wow.
guess one more thing, and maybe this will get you started again, and we still won't get to food. I do just want to say, especially for
Right.
the
We
younger
start
people
running
out
out
there,
of time
yeah.
soon. Yeah.
George W. Bush was a terrible president
The worst.
whose whose actions destabilized the world order and killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And for the people out there who are like, some of them, I guess, who maybe didn't live through the George W. Bush presidency, but plenty who did during the Trump presidency were sort of nostalgic for the George W. Bush
Yeah. Well, they
presidency.
forgot. That's all.
Yeah.
They just forgot. They forgot how bad it was. I'm watching this. I was at a gala the other night that Terrence Blanchard, the musician, was being honored at, and he mentioned that he'd done the soundtrack for Spike Lee's Katrina
Yeah.
thing,
I
which
saw,
is
look, I saw him.
4 hour HBO special.
Herbie Hancock came through Chapel Hill and he had Terrence Blanchard on trumpet, and
Yeah,
it
he's
was
great. He's really great.
amazing. Sorry, go
And
ahead.
so this 4 hours on Katrina, heartbreaking from the first second. That's all on Bush, or it's a lot on Bush.
Yeah.
And yeah, so his legacy is Iraq and Katrina, as far as I'm concerned. And he did like the worst possible job on both. So, and he wasn't any good doing anything else either. And he has this fucking smirk on his face
Yeah. Talk about
that's
smug.
so self-satisfied. Oh my god! All right, no one wants to listen to this. Let's talk about.
Okay.
We have like
So
20 minutes left. Let's
yeah,
talk
all
about.
right. So let's talk about food. Honestly, my guess is a lot of Pod Save America listeners would really enjoy that last 20 minutes we just did. So let's
A lot of former Pod Save
yeah.
America listeners.
So ostensibly I brought you in here today to talk about community kitchen.
Let's do that.
So let me just, before you tell us about community kitchen, let's just establish that the way we do food in this country, and frankly globally, but I'm guessing in large part because of the way we do food in this country,
Hmm.
is just a disaster. It is an environmental disaster. It is a health disaster. It is destroying the planet. It will eventually fail to produce any food at all, and we will all starve and die if the food system continues exactly as it does now. You could, I suppose, name a food czar in some hypothetical democratic socialist administration who will fix the food system, but that's clearly, we have to wait at least 4 years for such a top-down administrative technocratic food czar.
And it
So
it would
instead,
never happen
yeah,
top down. So never, never. I
so
mean,
we have
it'll
to
happen top down as soon as there's a true democratic republic here, but that's a ways away.
so we have to fix the food system ourselves however we can, through advocacy and direct action and just what we can do. I'm a big fan of farmers markets. I'm a big fan of community supported
Sure.
agriculture. There are these things you can do, and Mark, you're doing one of them.
Well, it goes back to, I mean, if we had started off with a little less hysterically in our conversation, there's a way it goes back to um, uh, how do you make change? And you make change, to me, it seems you make change by making the bad things less bad and making the good things better and more widely available. And yeah, we could have a government that would make the bad things less bad. I mean, you could pretend that Robert Kennedy is going to take on big pharma and big food, and maybe he will. And that would be an example of making the bad things less bad. And anything that would, I think the difference between quote unquote incrementalist, a progressive who's an incrementalist, and someone who thinks themselves as a revolutionary is that I know when I used to think of myself as a revolutionary, I thought that all reformers were traders. And reformers are
Mhm.
people who want to make things less bad. But that's a very 20-year-old assessment of things. And I'm a lot older than that now. And I think that making things less bad is really good to the extent you can do it. And I think so that argues for talking about supporting food stamps or increasing eligibility for food stamps or making it possible for the people who are eligible to understand that they're eligible, all of that. It argues for even for tech solutions to pesticides, to ways that you could reduce the use of pesticides to quote unquote through technology. And I would put quotes around that technology thing because the way technology is defined now means it all means profit making technology that originates in Silicon Valley, whereas let's not forget that the wheel is technology, or
Yeah.
that anything really that uses a new system to make life better could be called technology. So you could argue that educating girls and women in countries where that doesn't happen is a form of technology. But anyway,
Yeah, well, I'll just say people sometimes call these social technologies, something
right,
like education. Go for it.
right, right. So, but I think, if you can reduce the use of pesticides, you could reduce the use of fertilizer, you could reduce the use of water, you could use integrated pest management, rotating crops, very simple stuff. Any of that makes things less bad. But I think, and I'm all in favor of that. But I think at the same time, to have change, and this goes back as far as Aristotle and probably farther back than that. But if you want to make real and lasting change, you need new models. You need to see ways of doing things differently. And I think, since you're labeling yourself and your podcast as an anarchist, we can just say one of the reasons that leftists in the United States were so in love with the early Soviet Union and stayed in love with it long before any sane person would have, um, is that they thought, oh, well, here's a model of how things might be done. One of the reasons that people still, well, not really, but one of the reasons did until recently avidly support Cuba is that it was like, oh, they call themselves socialist, and indeed some things are different. It's a model. It's a shitty model, but it's a model. So I think it's our job to think about what we can do to create new models. And that's a long way of introducing what community kitchen is, which I think before I even say what it is, I'll say I believe that it's a model of one aspect of what a good food system would look like. So, what's a good food system would look like, or what's good food look like? And the answer to that question, as far as I'm concerned, is it's food that's grown by people who steward the earth and do their farming with minimal impact in as close to closed systems as is humanly possible. That requires, at the moment, that's only being done in the United States on small non corporate farms, but um, And it'll never be done on corporate farms, but it could be done on larger farms if we found a way to get land into the hands of more people who wanted to farm. But it starts with that. It continues with people up and down the food chain being paid respectably. Well, um, 7 of the 10 worst paying jobs in the United States are associated with food, and that goes from farm workers to truck drivers to retail clerks to stock people to slaughterhouse workers. That's among the most thankless jobs there is. To, of course, servers who are still paid. Many of them are still paid. Most of them are still paid on a tipped wage system, which allows them to be paid sub minimum wage, with tips supposedly making up the difference between that and minimum wage, which, by the way, minimum wage itself is not living wage. So if you want good food, you want to define it as being grown well by people who are being treated well, and then everybody between them and the person who cleans up after you is also treated well. Let's remember that during the pandemic, there were super high rates of, in New York anyway, there were super high rates of COVID among delivery workers, and those were the people who were bringing everybody their food. And of course, they couldn't afford to eat that food, most of it. And then the third thing, if we're counting, the third thing is you want to provide nutritious food, and that I could get into I mean, I've spent hours talking about ultra processed foods and the fact that 60 or 70% of our calories are now from ultra processed foods. And it doesn't take a genius to know that if all the calories, the majority of calories are from, ultra processed foods meet the dictionary definition of poison more closely than they meet the dictionary definition of food, because food's supposed to make you healthy and ultra processed foods make you sick. Poison makes you sick. So you could look it up. Um, so part of a good food system is delivering healthy food to people, and that happens to mean plant forward food, and will mean that forever. And then the final thing's equal access, and that's the really tricky part, because you can do those first three things pretty easily as long as you are willing to charge a lot of money for food. You can find good farmers, you can pay workers well, you can cook great food, and it's $150 a person per meal. So how do you do that and make that accessible at the same time? You have to do a nonprofit, or you have to plan to lose money somehow. And that's so Community Kitchen is a model that will do those four things: the farming, the labor, the nutrition, and the access, while losing money. It's a nonprofit. I'm currently raising money for it. And it will show that it's possible to do that. We just need to shift priorities. And that shifting priorities, that model that demonstrates that we have to shift priorities in order for people to be fed well. And by the way, it would pay for itself as a program, because it would so greatly reduce the national health care bill,
Mhm.
which is currently $5 trillion. Um, and I back of the envelope back of the envelope calculations, for whatever they're worth, indicate that you would save about $3 in healthcare for every dollar you spent on getting good food to people who are not otherwise getting good food. Um, that shifting priorities thing is why you like this, because because shifting priorities means government support for things that people need, not for things that corporations need, like um, ultra processed food, or whatever, oil, um, but things that people need, like public transportation and healthcare and food. And it's clear that we are subsidizing food. There's no free market out there, as I'm sure you talk about all the time. Um, there's a regulated market that's regulated in favor of the people who are making money at it, and that's certainly how the food system works. And if you objectively look at the food system, what you see is something very much like big pharma or big oil or almost anything else you can think of. It's a system that's organized to make money. And the fallout from that system, whether good or bad, some systems have more favorable fallout than others. but it's always incidental. I think you'd agree with that. It's like whatever happens from growing crops and turning them into quote unquote food, some of which is actually not food at all, as I said, um, is incidental. All that matters is that we own this land, we plant things in it, we grow them however we need to grow them, we sell them, we make money doing that, period. Everything else that happens, climate change, fossil fuel use, soil destruction, environmental damage, carcinogens in the air, ultra processed foods, food that's distributed inequitably. I'm sure I'm leaving some things out, but you
Yeah.
get the idea. All of that stuff, even even good food that keeps people healthy, it's all accidental. None of it is intentional. It's just what do we have to grow and process and label and sell to make money? And if Pepsi is more profitable than water, then it's Pepsi. Um, water's a, water's a really terrible example, actually. If Big Macs are more profitable than hummus, we're going to sell a lot of Big Macs. If hummus became more profitable than Big Macs, we'd be selling more hummus. Um, but the consequences of those decisions are only important to the owners of the system to the extent that they change the bottom line. Um, if people getting cancer or heart disease as a result of eating ultra processed foods were paid for by the people who produce the ultra processed foods, we might see that system change. As long as society at large is absorbing those costs, then those companies are free to pollute and poison and do everything else as much as they want because they're not bearing the consequences of that. Um, so to get to the model part, I'm sorry I strayed.
No,
Community kit.
no, I
I could
wouldn't.
do this in 30 seconds and then
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
No, go
Community
ahead.
kitchens idea is source great food, pay workers well, cook great food, and serve it on a sliding scale in neighborhoods where people need that. And we are in the process of trying to launch one of those. That's the summary.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll try and talk briefly and then shut up. I mean, the only thing I really need to say is that you're right. This is the kind of stuff that I like to talk about on this show. The idea that I mean, the great enemy still for me is the economist who explains we can't have these things. And in fact, if you look at it, the kind of the food system we have, frankly, it's economically it's inefficient just economically, even leaving aside the health cost of ultra processed foods. It's just economically efficient for CEOs and shareholders and this small group of people, and that's why it's so frustrating that it's explained to us, oh yeah, sure, we would all like the land to flow with hummus and locally sourced broccoli, but only wealthy people can afford that, because in fact poor people are paying for the terrible food they are getting, and the money is going to whatever you want to call them, the oligarchs now, the
Right,
billionaires.
right.
It's not that the system that you are describing is more expensive in any way. A good system, it's not more expensive than the current system. In fact, it would undoubtedly be much cheaper in some sort of sense of how much it would cost the environment, or if we we're doing
Yeah,
this
if we
back
were
to the old.
paying for those things, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what makes it. I have this parable a lot. Ruth Kenna, who is an expert on William Morris, came and said that William Morris, he became a socialist, a revolutionary socialist. He didn't want to. He just wanted to make beautiful things, and he made beautiful things. And they said, people said, okay, this is great, but you can only sell these to rich people. And he said, well, I want everyone to be able to buy them. And the economist of the day said, I'm sorry, poor and middle class people can't simply cannot buy nice handmade things. And Morris said,
Mm.
well, didn't they have nice handmade things in the Middle Ages? And aren't we supposedly richer now? And they said, I'm sorry, you can't have it. And so Morris becomes a revolutionary because he just thinks the very simple thought, people should be able to make nice things and make a living doing that, and other people should be able to get those nice things. And I hear community kitchen that, like, we should be able to have nice food where everyone is treated well. this
Yeah.
this this is utopian, but it's really not utopian.
Well, yeah, the thing that right. I mean, we agree as a society. We don't I don't know if agree is the right word. We have not questioned the traditions very much of collectively paying for the Department of Defense, police forces in every city, school lunches, Department of Education, public libraries, roads, railroads to a certain extent. Airplanes are obviously heavily subsidized by the federal and local governments. All these things are things we've agreed we all want. We haven't really agreed, actively agreed. And, you know, I'm sure our priorities would shift if we were all actively agreeing on these things. But it's just, for example, no one argues about federal support for airports. Very few people argue about federal support for submarines. And yet, here's this thing that could actually benefit the 60 or 70% of the people in the United States who are not eating well, could benefit almost everyone. And there's not even a, a broad discussion of how that might happen. So here we are having that discussion. And, I have that discussion every day with people, and some people think it's nutty and some people get it.
I guess, man, I don't know if I should probably just ask about community kitchen now, but I was thinking, bringing back to where we started this, which was just, a couple of old leftists bitching about the election. One of the crucial things in the election was the the price of groceries, and there's this sort of standard progressive canard trotted out that's like, oh well, the president doesn't have anything to do with the price of eggs. And that's true insofar as the president doesn't write an executive order about the price of eggs. But in fact, the US government pretty much does determine the price of eggs. And the president could promise a different food system. The other just, I was reading, I like to read old Life magazines. It's one of my hobbies. I was reading one from 1967, and it said that, the French pay, it was like two and a half times the amount of their national budget to food as opposed to the Americans. And we're talking 1967. And I know something similar to that is happening right now. Americans have this deep abiding belief that they shouldn't spend much money on food. I'm sure you've encountered this. And I mean, frankly, I guess this isn't a question. This is, I mean, I guess this is a question. I'm baffled. Why is this? Why are Americans willing to spend money on cars and phones and everything, but they just think food, it's vital. It's one of the great sources of joy and is the only source of sustenance in life. Why do we treat it as this almost like nuisance?
Well, there is an answer to that. I mean, I will say, just as a sort of side note, the more money people spend on food, the less money they spend on healthcare, generally speaking.
Yeah.
The healthier they are. So that's one of the reasons why you could afford to support a national food program, and just spend less money on our rather informal national healthcare system. We thought food was cheap. America, there's no more bountiful country in the world. There certainly wasn't in the 20th century, turn of the 20th century, well into the 20th century. It became obvious to food manufacturers what was most profitable, had the longest shelf life, could could be altered in ways that people would like, and then be engineered in ways that people were being trained to like. And all of this happened in since World War II. Almost all of this happened in the second half of the 20th century. And the best book on this subject, although it's not new at this point, but it's the best and book on the subject is about 20 years old, is by my former Times colleague Michael Moss, called either Sugar, Fat, Salt, or Short Salt, Sugar, Fat, or Fat, Salt, Sugar, or one of those. But put those three words in and you'll get it. And that book is about the manipulating of food, almost entirely ultra processed food, to hit the centers of our brains that respond to those flavors and those sensations in ways similar to opioids, the way opioids trigger those centers of our brains. So I think sort of the ideal example of that is probably hot Cheetos or, ranch Doritos or so. If you just think of something that's got umami and salt and sugar and um, monosodium glutamate is unquestionably going to be on the ingredient list because it's basically powdered umami, and crunch and fat, it's all right there. And that you can't help but like that. You know, people who are dedicated to defeating the modern food system and substituting for it something that nourishes everybody and doesn't fuck up the planet can't resist hot Cheetos, I mean, I happen not to like them, but ranch Doritos I kind of get. And but that's the why. We came to be acclimated to inexpensive food, and the food that is inexpensive is also somewhat addictive, and it has been engineered to please us, and we have been trained to enjoy it. And that food is largely less expensive per calorie than food that's good for you. So there is an answer to that. That's not a,
Yeah.
that's an answerable question, I think.
Yeah, and I was as you were talking, I was even thinking of how, I mean, so tobacco is pretty much straight up a poison, and cotton isn't a product, but sugar and coffee have been the engines of exploitation and colonialism. Bananas, I mean, even before this big switch after World War II, you can think of the Western world as wanting if you think about sugar as the original processed food, you can think about the legacy of slavery and
Sure.
colonialism has been about the quest for European and American palates for processed food. I think you can put it right at the heart of so many of the
Yeah.
ills.
I mean, if you track the spread of coffee, tea, sugar, especially um, through the world, you track the spread of slavery and yeah, sugar until quite recently still needs cheap labor, but was completely reliant on slavery as it was growing and spreading throughout the world, for sure. Um,
Yeah.
it's all very
This is
modern. I mean, Animal Vegetable Junk, my book that caught your attention a few years ago, Animal Vegetable Junk is a lot about this, but there's much, much more to say about it. And while the history is fascinating, and it really is, what's going on right now is hard enough to understand without even bothering with the history. And it remains racist, sexist, unequal in every, inequitable in every imaginable way, um, damaging in every way. It's enough to understand what's going on now. How we got here is fascinating, but if we could just, I don't care anymore.
yeah,
I mean, I care about the history because it's interesting, but I just want people to understand the present because the present is dramatic enough from a food
yeah. I just
perspective.
want to act because I don't think we brought it up. The suffering of animals in this system is
Hmm.
obviously also incalculable. And yeah, I mean, I like where you brought us, and this is a good place to end the system we have. Has been built up for centuries, to be horrible to the planet, to everyone, to the eaters, but it's your job, it's all of our job. That's not you, Mark, but it's your job as well to, make food better today, tomorrow. I mean, that's the only thing that's going to change it, is if we are, as you are, creating new models, educating people, doing food differently. The government's not going to sweep in and solve food, just like everything else. We're going to do it.
Right.
And you're doing it,
Yeah,
Mark. I
well, it
appreciate
is
it very much.
ultimately it's gonna be a great, I mean, that's to go back to where we started. Even if he wasn't, I don't wanna be insulting or unreasonable. Even if he wasn't visibly erratic and an odd storyteller, I'm not talking about our president now, I'm talking
Yeah.
about our nominee for Health and Human Services. Um, Even if that weren't the case, I mean, it would be great to have. I don't want, again, making things less bad is a good thing. And if we had a progressive USDA chief, FDA chief, and so on, it would be terrific. I don't think this guy is it. Even if he were, he's not going to remake the food system. He would just make things a little less bad. We could still hope for that, but yeah, my fear is we're looking for 2028. I don't know, but we're, for that part to happen. But it's important, as you say, for us to be working on this as citizens and individual activists and collective activists now.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Mark, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It was a real pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Graham. Take care.